So, the pandemic shone a spotlight on the existing trade world order. So, what have we learned? How are countries shaping up to doing international business differently? Is there a smart solution to competing with China? These are some of the questions that our speakers who are joining me now will explore in the following session. I'm delighted to welcome to our virtual stage Nisha Biswal, the president of the US-India Business Council in Washington, D.C., Sachit Jain, vice chair and MD at Vardhman, Ehmann, director of public affairs at Tata, and Dhiraj Nayyar, the director of economics and policy at Vedanta. Welcome to you all. Nisha, I want to start with you from a US perspective. I'd love to hear any quick anecdote on how you saw companies reacting to sudden trade disruption posed during the pandemic.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Great. So, the pandemic had enormous disruption. And what we saw was that we changed the way we lived, we changed the way we worked, and we changed the way that we did commerce. And so you saw a rapid acceleration of the digital economy. You saw a massive shift in the way that we work with the work from home and the virtual workplace. And you saw the way we did commerce with the reliance on e-commerce to essentially get us through the pandemic. A lot of these changes are I think, going to stay with us. The other big change that came, through the pandemic and disruption that we saw was an over-reliance on supply chains concentrated in any one geography at a time when global travel and global commerce was disrupted. I think itself became into question. And I think there is a rethinking of what global supply chains mean and a move towards more regional, closer to market location of supply chains. So these are some of the ways in which I think the pandemic has really changed us for the years to come.
Sachit, let's get that question to you as well. Is there any anecdote you can tell me about how your company reacted to the sudden trade disruptions during the pandemic?
So we reacted a little differently than many other companies were. We quickly took stock of the situation and decided immediately that we will not have any layoffs, we will not cut any salaries, we will protect our people because we believe that over time, we don't know how long will this last, but we need to be strong, keep our people together, that when the things change after this, we are ready to take advantage of the opportunities. And as we saw last year, I didn't know that the explosion in growth would happen so fast immediately in India. But we were, as an organization, ready for the growth. Our supply chains were intact, our people were highly motivated, and we were able to meet all the increased demands. And as a result, eventually, what was looking at a disastrous year turned out to be our best year performance till date. So we were lucky.
So, Dhiraj, do you think the pandemic has had a profound enough impact to impact global trading activity in the longer term?
Well, I think global trade was already moving in a particular direction even before the pandemic came. So, global trade tends to move in cycles. There are periods where the world is more optimistic and, positive about global trade, and there are periods when it's not. So, there was a period of great openness before the First World War, then there was the two wars, then there was a period of relative close between the post-war period, then there was the globalization we saw, and then we saw the post-global financial crisis, a kind of growing pessimism, especially in the US, the UK and the advanced countries. So I think this moves in cycles, but I believe that in every cycle there's an opportunity for certain countries to use the disruption to their advantage. I think disruptions help certain countries which are behind the curve, such as India, which has been behind the curve on trade. But this disruption now, particularly the desire to build more diversified supply chains, gives a country like India the opportunity to strengthen its manufacturing base by engaging in trade with, favorable countries, or countries where there are complementarities. So even if there is pessimism on trade and certain countries may see supply chains diversified against them, I think there are opportunities for other countries like India. So I view the disruption as very positive sitting here in Delhi and in India.
What about you, Alex? How does Tata view the disruption and the impact on supply chains? What's your view now that we're 18 months or beyond into this pandemic?
Well, thank you. I think in Tata terms, clearly Tata is such a diverse set of companies that each company will have reacted in slightly different ways. But it's fair to say that the corporate world overall moved from a kind of risk management approach as an academic exercise to one where it was a very difficult and lived experience. And I think one of the things that one of the earlier speakers touched on that's really important here is the opportunity that has emerged for India and that continues to present itself. The desire to try and diversify supply chains has been mentioned, sort of localization agendas, but more broadly just to ensure resilience within supply chains offers, I think, a fantastic opportunity for both the UK and India to move into areas of strength that they perhaps aren't as strong in today, and that is something I think that both countries need to work mutually on, because there are some combined benefits that could come from the trade negotiations that are presently ongoing between the two countries too.
Nisha, let's come back to you. From the perspective of trade, how do you think the US is recalibrating its trade partnerships across the world?
Well, look, I think what so many countries, and particularly democracies like the United States, the UK, and India, are looking at hit countries hard, and it hit the workers hard. And so you're seeing a more inward look at what needs to be done to strengthen the economy and to support the workforce. But what I think would be a wrong lesson for any of these three countries to take away from all of this is to discount the importance and the impact of global trade. So you have a new administration in the United States, but you have all three countries very focused right now on overcoming the pandemic, as they should be, and on trying to build resiliency in their economies. But I think for our three countries, which are perhaps outside of some very important trading blocs in Asia and Europe, that it's important that we be engaging with each other, building bilateral agreements, and making sure that we are advancing global opportunity in ways that will enhance and benefit our own economies. So I expect to see a Biden administration get much more active on trade as we approach the end of the year than they perhaps have been coming in as they focused more on the pandemic.
So Sachit, let's go to you. You obviously work in textiles and steel. You do a lot of trade with Japan. I wonder if you could tell me your perspective from dealing with a country like Japan. Do you see Japan going towards more self-reliance, towards looking to really localize the supply chain, or is there a different perspective, a more global perspective?
So our experience from a joint venture we have in our steel company, we have Toyota Group's steel company, Aichi Steel, as our partners. The part of their strategy is to become part of the global supply chain of Toyota for Southeast Asia. So in fact, that was their strategy, that they want to diversify away from Japan in terms of their manufacturing location. And they are continuing to strengthen that strategy by investing more money and having bigger expansion plans in India. And in the next couple of years, we'll be developing even stronger plans to expand further to become a stronger partner in Toyota's global supply chain.
Thank you. And Dhiraj, can I ask you a question as well? You're the chief economist for a large mining company. Obviously, we haven't seen the demand for minerals decrease. How is the supply chain issue affect you, and what have you seen in terms of changes with the major companies that you work with?
So in India, in fact, during the course of this pandemic, we've seen obviously there was an initial fall in demand, but I think global demand has been quite robust lately, particularly again led by China. In fact, China is what is driving the demand for all key metals and minerals as of now, and so are the advanced countries, I mean, relative to the emerging economy. So I think, again, sitting in India, I think the opportunity was there in exports and continues to be there in exports. While in India, we traditionally look at ourselves as a large market and, we'd like to do business within India. Remember, the Indian economy total size is $2.7 trillion, whereas the global merchandise trade market by itself is $18 trillion. So even if that pie is not growing very much, India only has a 1.5% share in that. So for us, the opportunity to increase our share at this particular point in time, including in metals and minerals, is huge. So I'm very optimistic about exports finally becoming an engine of India's growth, which haven't been traditionally. And in India, we've always had a very import-focused view of trade, which is why we always talk about self-reliance, because we view trade through the lens of imports. But there is another very important lens of trade, which is exports. And I think exports and imports must go together. And I see the opportunity coming up in the next couple of years. So I think metals, again, extremely robust global demand. Commodity prices are strong because of the liquidity in the system. So we are looking at the scenario quite optimistically.
Interesting. So let's talk about these long overdue free trade agreements with the EU and the UK. Could we see these being expedited in the post-pandemic world? Alex, what do you think?
Well, I think from Tata's perspective, we do see it as a priority. We hope very much that trade, these bilateral trade deals can be pushed forward as agendas in the relevant geographies. I think the opportunity is very, very profound in some kind of key areas of potential working together. Some preliminary work we've been doing at the moment is showing us that the modelling systems that governments use to look at trade are perhaps neglecting some of the factors that make the potential between, say, UK and India really quite profound. Without getting overly geeky about it, they use things called gravity modelling, and gravity modelling tends to be predisposed towards showing gains in clearly defined markets that are already well developed and in geographical proximal areas. And I think as a result, when you look at the bounds and leaps that we've taken in digital transformation in this last 18 months, 2 years, it cannot be taken for granted the opportunity that in collaboration within digital and computer services between the two countries, and the almost unfettered potential, if this is gotten right on FTA grounds, to really have a mutual benefit for both India and the UK, and also for the separate bilateral with the EU.
So I wonder, Nisha, if you would like to comment as well. The issue of digital trade is pretty interesting, and it's one that's been really accelerated by the pandemic. I wonder if this is something that affects how the Biden administration, when it looks abroad, might look towards India as well.
Well, look, I think the pandemic can be an enormous boon for India as we think about an economy that is increasingly going to be driven by digital trade, by the service economy, by the virtual workplace. India, a country with an enormous skilled and talented workforce, could really benefit from a drive towards greater digitization. But it's going to require some investment by India in the soft infrastructure, in the IT infrastructure, in the skilling and education field. And then it's going to take a lighter touch on the regulatory and policy framework. Because if you don't have an ease in data transfer and cross-border data flows, if you are very focused on digital sovereignty, you cannot become the kind of skilled labor force for the global digital ecosystem. And so India is going to have to, in some ways, play the larger game for the global game and not just in terms of how it looks to protect its own market. I think there's more for India to gain by opening up than there is by trying to protect its own markets.
Given what we've heard Nisha say there, I'd love to hear from Sachit, from Dhiraj, about whether they think, you also think that these long overdue free trade agreements with the EU, with the UK, could be expedited. Sachit, what do you think?
I think this is a phenomenal opportunity for both India and UK on one side and India and EU. I believe this was on the table about 7 or 8 years ago. We were very close to finalizing that, but for some reasons it fell apart. I believe we are talking again on this area. Now, India and EU and India and UK are very complementary economies, because there are advantages in India which in partnership together, we are not really threatening each other, we are not competing with each other, we can complement each other and strengthen the markets of EU and UK can be taken in for Indian apparel, for example, and for textile. It's a huge opportunity. And there could be certainly goods from EU and UK which could be imported into India. So this is a phenomenal opportunity, and I'm very, very pleased to see this happening, because together, if we become stronger, we become another ecosystem to be able to compete with some of the other countries of the world.
Dhiraj, what do you think about that, the free trade agreements? Could they be expedited now?
Absolutely, and I think in India we chose the wrong strategy on free trade agreements. We went and signed free trade agreements with the ASEAN countries, Japan and Korea first, which had a much more competitive manufacturing sector than we did, and we couldn't capitalize on those FTAs, and again that reinforced the pessimistic view about trade in India. Now I think any of the EU or the UK or even the US for that matter, though we're not talking about that right now, I think would reinvigorate, and what Nisha spoke about, that India being defensive about its markets, I think that could change if India was to engage in FTAs with the EU and UK in particular. I think it'll be a great boon for India, and of course we will gain. I'm sure our partners would gain as well. As Sachit said, there are complementarities, but I think it will also give us much more confidence about trade. And I think India needs to just be a little more confident about the potential for trade. And our past experience, as I said, hasn't always been positive, but I think this could certainly change the game.
So I'd love to hear, Nisha, about whether you think that India might be replacing China within the Biden administration's list of prioritizing. We saw in the previous administration an ongoing conversation back and forth. What do you think the new Biden administration thinks about China versus its relationship with India?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't put it in such zero-sum terms. I think that China will continue to be economically very important to the United States, to India, and to the global economy. But there's no doubt that India is a rising power, a rising economic power, as well as a strategic power, and that the U.S.-India relationship, both in terms of strategic and security importance, but increasingly in terms of the economic potential and power and importance of the U.S.-India corridor, is a high priority for the Biden administration and will be for every subsequent administration in the United States. And it is certainly a very high priority, a top 5 market and probably even a top 3 market for almost every major company in the United States.
Thank you. So I'm delighted now that we're able to be joined by Piyush Goyal, the Minister of Railways, Commerce and Industry in India. Thank you so much for joining us, for coming straight from your meeting to being with us. Really appreciate it. Tell me, with around 18 months of post-pandemic firefighting behind you, what are some of the actions that your government took that you think were right on target, and what do you wish now, with the benefit of hindsight, that you had done? Oh no, I think we lost our minister. We will try to get him back. Wait for a moment to see if he's there. No, we'll come back to our panel, waiting patiently to come back come back. I'd love to hear more about whether this could be, there's a whole discussion about the difference between, has the pandemic produced this really inward look towards national production, and countries like Australia, for example, that depended on pharmaceutical imports are now looking to places like China, India, to see how they can develop this. I'd love to hear from your perspectives the ways that you're working with countries. We've already heard a little bit about Japan, for example, but how you're working with countries to strengthen ties and manufacturing supply chains so that it's a benefit for both countries, but also helps the home country not be so reliant on imports. Alex, I wonder if you could take that.
Well, I think one of the things that's very interesting when we were talking about resilience earlier, and it plays to your question, is that India, I think, has done incredibly well in resilience terms in its own strength areas. So if you look at some of the businesses we're involved with, you look at the TCSs of the world, who are servicing many global businesses and organisations across the globe. Even though COVID has interrupted our lives in such a dreadful way, a business like TCS and many like it have been still incredibly successful. In fact, all the more successful in servicing and progressing change within those global corporate entities. So I think, if anything, the pace of change looks even stronger. The opportunity looks even greater. And it's very, and that's in stark contrast, I think, to the earlier points we were discussing about how many boardrooms have been looking and continue to look at really manufacturing global supply chain resilience, and the weaknesses of over-reliance on single geographies or even just not diverse enough a set of geographies for that supply chain. I think in stark contrast, India and some of the areas of kind of digital innovation in which India is so strong have really come to the fore and have shown themselves to be at the absolute opposite end and have been immense success stories.
Thank you. We'll be working to bring our minister back in a moment. Sachit, from the private sector perspective, where would you like to see the Indian government really focus its actions as it negotiates trade deals and works with the private sector?
So one, I think I'd like to bring out here very clearly, this PLI scheme has brought out very that how to make manufacturing very important in India. It's a very important scheme linked to the earlier reduction of corporate tax rates. So India has become a far more attractive destination to manufacture than what it was earlier. And as has been said by some of the speakers earlier, many countries, the developed markets like the US, EU, UK, and Japan are realizing that over-reliance on any one country could become a problem in the future. So this is the opportunity that is to take to invite key manufacturers from these developed countries to set up marquee plants in India, because once a global plants come in, then they develop an ecosystem around them, and that is what can lead to the very fast development of India. So I'm very optimistic that the government is moving in the right direction and is moving fast, and we hope once this, in the next few months, we'll see more action taking place.
Dhiraj, what about you from the private sector perspective? Where would you like to see the Indian government really focusing its actions as it negotiates trade deals?
So my view is very clear that, in the first place, foreign investors, whether American or European, did not go to China because they particularly love the political system or the openness or anything else. I mean, I think the fact is that China has a certain competitiveness which is induced by its policy environment, and I think India needs to catch up. You cannot have a situation where you cannot compete with China on land costs, on labor costs, on capital costs, on power costs, on freight costs. If all these things are higher in India because of various policy distortions, investors ultimately will make a cold call. Where is the return higher, whether in China or India? They're not going to come to India purely on sentiment or purely on the sentiment of diversification of supply chains. So I think one of the things Sachit just mentioned on production-linked incentives, I think the government is taking certain measures to bridge that gap. Certain structural non-competitiveness that India has, the production-linked incentives, certain amount of raising of tariffs. I know these are frowned upon in most parts of the world. As an economist, when I would normally frown upon them, but for the short run, I think to bridge that gap of cost competitiveness with China, some of these interventions are needed, and the government is doing them. So I think they realize that, but at the same time, they're also working on the fundamental reforms I spoke about labor, about capital markets or banking, or cleaning up your long overdue non-performing assets in the banking system. So I think fundamental structural reform is ongoing, but there are intermediate measures being put in place so that we can avail of the opportunity right now. We don't have to wait for those structural reforms to reach their logical conclusion, which may take a year or two. We've got something in the interim which makes us as competitive as China is.
Thank you. So I wasn't aware that my question made you go so off target, Minister. But let's come back to you. Tell me about some of the actions that you took that you think were right on, and what you wish you had done with the benefit of hindsight.
The whole answer, literally, and didn't realize you got connected. Here, if at all we get disconnected, please let me know again. But something seems to be wrong on this connection. Anyway, we learned, we took some very, very important steps early on in the pandemic. We went into the lockdown last year because we realized India was not well prepared to face the pandemic. There were concerns around availability of essential supplies, our testing ability, our healthcare facilities. The COVID protocols were yet not understood by people. The personal protective equipment, masks, all of these were in short supply. And I think the lockdown of last year gave us time to really prepare the nation to face this pandemic. Beyond that, we have been able to maintain our economic activity at reasonably good levels and focus on micro-containment zones to overcome the problems of the pandemic. We've been able to meet the needs of the nation even as the pandemic took some really ugly turn in April and May earlier on, where our numbers went to as high as 412,000 per day. Of course, they are very rapidly falling now. We are at 40,000 a day now. The deaths have also fallen from about 4,500 a day to under 1,000 a day now. But a lot of lessons have been learned along the way. We've continuously reoriented and rejigged our processes and our operating programs, our SOPs, our guidelines, and without shutting down economic activity. I think we are now able to face the pandemic much smarter. Our vaccination program is rolling out very, very rapidly. Today we have done more vaccines than the United States of America in absolute numbers, despite the fact that we are a much smaller economy. Our economic power, our per capita GDP, all of those are of a less developed nation or a developing nation.
Why do you think that is? Why have you been able to vaccinate more than the United States?
In terms of absolute vaccination numbers, in the sense we've done about 340 million vaccines so far. Now we have a large population, we are 4 times the size of the US, so obviously our demand is going to be much more. But imagine, despite being a less developed country or a developing nation, we have already crossed 340 million vaccines. We are currently doing 5 million a day, which we hope to ramp up further in the days to come. And we are confident that we will continue to maintain our precautions. So like the UK or US, we are not going to give up on masks or just allow the people to be, just get out of their homes without any social distancing or any COVID protocols. We are going to maintain our safeguards. We are going to maintain our masks. In fact, we are promoting double masks now. We are helping people overcome vaccine hesitancy, which was prevalent in a big way. I believe it's there all over the world. I'm told that there's vaccine hesitancy even in the developed world. And we are confident that India will work as a nation, all the states, the central government working as a team. We are happy to share our learnings also with other countries. For example, our COVID app, through which we have done the vaccination program. It's been a remarkable success. And now large parts of the world are asking us for the COVID app to be implemented in their countries. And we are happy to share all that we have learned free of charge, unlike some of the other countries which are even looking at profits while the world needs to be saved through the collective effort of the world. We have tried in WTO to promote a waiver on TRIPS so that vaccines and essential medicines can be available to all in the world. Sadly, the European countries particularly and many other developed countries are not supporting that move. It pains me that even when the world is facing such a big challenge, and believe me, until all of us are vaccinated, until everybody in the world gets the benefit of modern technology, even the developed world will not be safe. So it's very, very unfortunate that some countries still put profit over prudence. And I do hope that forums like the India Global Forum will give out a loud message to the people of these developed countries that they also are enjoined with certain responsibilities towards global good.
I'd love to stay on that issue that you just raised there with the WTO. India and South Africa together have asked to release some of the intellectual property on vaccines, not just vaccines, but other issues around PPE relating to the pandemic. What do you say to that argument that we've heard most recently from the EU coming back that we can't release the intellectual property? It'll impact too much on the ability of pharmaceutical companies to continue to be innovative. What do you say to that argument?
That's the choice they have to make, whether the profits of the pharmaceutical companies are more important than saving lives all over the world, including in their countries. In this globally connected world, howsoever much they may try to insulate their countries from the rest of the world, believe me, it's going to be near impossible. So I think that's a choice that they will have to make. That's a decision they will have to take about what they believe is good for their country and their economies. I personally believe that it's extremely myopic of any country to believe that they are insulated and they would remain safe even if other parts of the world do not. And I think today is not the time even for the pharma companies to be counting their dollars and their green bucks. Today is the time for the world to support each other. Today is the time for the world to work as one family and get rid of this pandemic at the fastest.
Minister, I want you to stay there. I saw one of our panelists raising her hands. I think, Nisha, did you want to come in on that WTO question? Did you want to respond to that intellectual property moment?
Well, only to say that, look, I couldn't agree more with the minister that unless we all overcome the pandemic, none of us can overcome the pandemic. And I think that we are all completely aligned on the imperative of global collaboration and cooperation to overcome that pandemic. The United States is working very closely with India, and there are important partnerships, including, what was discussed at the Quad meeting to support and boost India's manufacturing capacity on vaccines, to invest in scaling up that manufacturing, and to support joint ventures between some of the producers of these vaccines in the West, including, the AstraZeneca vaccine, the J&J vaccine, I think the Novavax vaccine, which has just come online, and others, because we see that deep capability that India has. But we also don't think that a proliferation around the world of manufacturing capabilities that are perhaps not there, and equipment that is not there, and the ingredients that are not there, if you create just a mad dash to develop capacity everywhere around the world where perhaps the systems are not in place, I think it'll slow things down. And the countries that have those capabilities and can really scale them up is where we should be concentrating our resources. It's been a very successful model with India, and I don't know that we need to necessarily break what is already working, especially at a time of crisis. So I just wanted to say I agree with the minister's goals. I just think that perhaps there are other ways as well of achieving that in a more streamlined fashion.
Minister, we'll come back to you to
My
react.
apologies.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Nisha, that's what the apologists for the pharma companies want to propagate. And obviously, if you share technology in an organized manner, we'll be able to get good manufacturing up and about. If we don't do that, you'll find people trying to do reverse engineering, and then you will have a bigger problem on your head of unauthorized vaccines, unauthorized medicines, and that's more dangerous for the world. I think it's a typical pharma company story. It's one sector which on the one hand saves lives. It's a sector which on the one hand does great social service to humanity, and on the other hand, at the time of this pandemic, such a huge crisis before the world, is looking at profit over public good. And really pains me to hear these kind of arguments that it'll impact innovation, it'll impact invention. Well, all of that, we have tons and tons of things to invent. We have huge amount of profits to be made in the future. But we first got to get rid of this pandemic, get economies back in shape. Otherwise, people will lose jobs, people will lose livelihoods, and then in any case, their spend on pharma companies' products will be affected much more than the few billions that they may lose in sharing their technology today. That's my view. Each one is entitled to their view. I have absolutely no intention to stifle each country's own views. But it's a very, very myopic strategy that some countries are following.
And I also think that we learned from the AIDS epidemic and how long it took those medicines, those treatments to reach parts of the world. 10 years to reach Africa after they had been through the United States. And it was really India and India's manufacturing capacity that convinced pharmaceutical companies that they could do it and that they could do it cheaper. So you have some experience with this. I invite you to answer more on that. I'd love to hear just one moment from you on when you now look forward in the countries that you want to trade with. We talk about how to make India so integral to supply chains. I wonder if you're seeing a shift in sentiment, Minister.
Well, very clearly, India is working towards greater engagement with countries with which we have a shared ecosystem, countries which believe in transparent, rules-based trading mechanisms. We are looking at a greater degree of engagement with countries which are democratic in their political system, with which we can relate and trust as a partner. And therefore, as you may be aware, we are working very actively with the United Kingdom. In fact, that's one partnership that's going to take wings, in my personal opinion, faster than any other. Canada and Australia are showing huge promise in terms of their wanting to expand the engagement with India. We have started dialogue with the European Union for a free trade agreement on goods, services, and investment protection agreement, and a geographical indicators agreement. But given the nature of the EU with so many 27 odd countries, it'll certainly be probably much more long drawn affair. But we on our part are extremely keen to speed it up. I think only yesterday or day before I had a long chat with the incoming presidency, Slovenia, to work out how we can continue the momentum that the Porto summit has built up. And all in all, I am convinced that India will be playing a much greater role in the post-pandemic world in creating resilient supply chains with these countries and other countries like Japan, like Korea, with whom we share strong bonds, not only economic, not only people to people, but as Nisha mentioned, also very strong geopolitical interests reflected, for example, in the Quad that Australia, Japan, the US, and India have promoted. So I see a very rapid turnaround. I can only share with you, India has done a record growth in exports in our first quarter when we had the second wave at its peak. So April to June, which we are closing today, the numbers are going to come out tomorrow morning in my desk. But I know that the exports from India in this quarter are the highest ever possibly in India's history. The railway freight that we carry, and that's a good indicator of mobility and goods movement. The railway freight from April to June 2021 is the highest ever in the history of Indian Railways. So we are seeing many such positive indicators. Our trusted partners can look for a greater role for India. We are opening our doors wider, so we'll be looking at investments, technology. We'll be looking at high quality goods, capital goods, equipment, machinery from our trusted partners. And we'll be looking at providing high quality technology support through our services sectors, our IT sector, many of our areas where we have competitive and comparative.
I think we're losing him. Well, he's frozen there. I'm going to give our other panelists just 20 seconds to respond. They've got a captive audience in the minister who's still there on screen. What do you want? What's your message to the Indian government? What can they do to help you more? Let's start, Alex, with you.
Well, I think, as I touched on earlier, the fantastic opportunity in the free trade agreement the Minister was just referring to between the UK and India needs to be seen through the prism of not just what the two countries do today, but to really look forward 10, 20, 30 years to the types of opportunities that are ahead of both countries. I think there are mutually kind of congruent opportunities there for regulatory alignment, for FTA alignment, and that will provide very significant uptick to the potential of trade between the two nations.
Thank you. 20 seconds from you, Sachit.
With the PLI scheme, with the lower corporate tax, the setting is already made for massive growth in the country. I think we also need to invest a little bit more on making India a more attractive place to live in for foreigners to come in, that they can start living in other cities than the major cities. The social infrastructure is an area to work on.
Thank you. And Dhiraj, what's your message?
I think this government has done perhaps the most number of reforms since 1991. We opened up our economy in 1991. So I think we are already going through that process now. So I would only wish the minister and the government continues to reform. I think there's nothing stopping the India story as long as we continue on down the path we've taken.
I'd like to thank all of my panel for bearing with us. It's been a fascinating discussion about trade, about the future post-pandemic. So thank you so much, Nisha, Sachit, Alex, Dhiraj. And also a big thank you to the Minister Piyush Goyal for joining us straight from a meeting.